فأدب مع الله علا وجل بأن تلازم الحياة والذل منكسرا تحت الحياة وخاضعا تحت المهابة إليه ضارعا.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين وصلوات ربي وسلامه على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم وبعد. So to continue inshallah with the book by Imam al-Ghazali, Bidayatul Hidayah, and we left off previously where we were discussing the three types of individuals who Al-Ghazali rahimahullah details when it comes to seeking knowledge. And the third he mentions is the person who has completely fallen under the sway of shaitan. He seeks his knowledge only to attain this dunya, and we were discussing one of the main desires that a person may have when it comes to the dunya is seeking out fame, seeking to become known. And this is a modern issue that we find with social media platforms, wherein you might find particular individuals or groups, etc., that will discuss controversial topics, or they will constantly attack others, etc., or they will put out very problematic topics for discussion or videos, and their purpose is to seek out fame, to become known. There is a famous Arabic saying, they say, "Khalif tu'raf." If you go against the norms of society, or you bring out the controversy, then you will become known by others. And so we have to be very careful with our intentions. And he discusses why this person has become lost and why he is under the sway of shaitan, i.e. this person who seeks knowledge for other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's sake. And he says it is because this person has convinced himself that he is from the saved individuals, because he is a person of knowledge. And this goes back to the issue that we were talking about on the first episode, I believe, wherein we discussed that a person may feel safe due to the fact that they ascribe to a particular group, or they ascribe to a particular name, or they may have adopted a particular slogan, and this gives them a false sense of safety, and this is very dangerous. And just to clarify, for those that may have forgotten what we have taken in the previous episode, that this is the third person, the person who has convinced himself that he is saved due to being a person of knowledge, even though he is not applying his knowledge and he is using his knowledge to seek out other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's sake. As for the person who is seeking knowledge for other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's sake, but he is aware of that fact, and he knows what he is doing is wrong, he has the chance of rectifying his intention. And this is why it's very important for us to always assess ourselves and rectify ourselves. But on the point of sloganeering and a false sense of safety, this is something which is very dangerous, because it can lead us to major issues. An example, a person may feel safe because they have adopted a particular theological perspective, or they adhere or ascribe to a particular group. Therefore, they justify the minor sins that they commit with the fact that they are following a particular theology, or they are ascribed to a particular group. Or they are willing to forgive others where they will not forgive someone who is not from their group. They forgive a person from their group for a particular issue, but they do not forgive someone else who is not from their particular group. And these biases and these partisanship like delvings start to take place. So we have to be very careful, and we have to rectify our intentions, assess our intentions, and know our intentions. And as was mentioned in the beginning, this requires a understanding of the self, and this comes with constant questioning and assessment. He then says, فَإِن قُلْتَ فَمَا بِدَايَةُ الْهِدَايَةِ لِأُجَرِّبَ نَفْسِي فِيهَا. And now he's saying, a person may say, if you say, what is the beginning of guidance, so that I can try myself and I can try to determine where I am on this path of guidance. فَاعْلَمْ أَنَّ بِدَايَتَهَا ظَاهِرُ التَّقْوَى وَنِهَايَتَهَا باطن التقوى فلا عاقبة إلا للتقوى ولا هدى إلا للمتقين. He says, know that the beginning of guidance starts with the apparent acts of taqwa, and the end of guidance is with the inner taqwa, the inner states of taqwa, the inner actions of taqwa. فلا عاقبة إلا للتقوى. There is no good ending except through taqwa, God consciousness, and guidance does not come except to those who are God conscious. And our person may ask a question, I am seeking guidance, God consciousness, but Imam al-Ghazali here is saying that there is no guidance except for the God conscious. If I am not yet God conscious, then how can I attain guidance? The answer is in the beginning of the statement. He says, بِدَايَتَهَا ظَاهِرُ التَّقْوَى. The beginning of guidance is through the application of the outward acts of God consciousness, i.e. guidance. What are those outward acts? The acts of salah, the acts of tahara, the acts of zakah, the acts of hajj and umrah, the acts of that relate to our social interactions, making sure that in all of those areas I am following the legislation given to me by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through His last and final Prophet Muhammad alayhi salam. So in order to understand this and to achieve this, a person needs to understand the ahkam of Islam, the rulings, legal rulings of Islam. Therefore, a person should study fiqh. Likewise, a person needs to understand the theological basics of Islam. And usually when a person studies fiqh, if they study it according to the traditional method of studying a madhab, they will study a madhab in theology alongside that. So on this point, a person who wishes to attain the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, a person who wishes to tread the path of guidance towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala needs education in 3 areas. The first area is the ahkam of Islam, which is summarized in the books of fiqh. The second area, the foundational elementary principles of theology, Islamic theology. And these are usually found in the books of aqaid, of Islamic theology and creed. And the third is the issues of inner taqwa, piety, inner God consciousness. And these are found in the books of tazkiyah, ihsan, suluk, tasawwuf, etc. So a person should try their utmost to study a book or to find a teacher that can teach them fiqh, that can teach them theology and can teach them purification of the soul. And it's very important to follow a traditional path in fiqh and in theology. Why? Because this provides a person with a safety net and a framework which prevents them from falling into some of the traps of the modern times that we are living in. And a question might arise for some, those that perhaps have not had exposure to some of the traditional schools of fiqh and theology. A person may ask, but I want to study according to the Quran and the Sunnah. I don't want to study according to the opinion of a person from our ummah. The 4 imams of Islam, i.e. fiqh, they are imams that have taken the rulings and the principles of understanding from the companions and the tabi'een that came before them or during their time. So ultimately the 4 schools of fiqh are all schools of fiqh based upon the understanding of the companions of the Quran and the Sunnah. And Imam Ahmad, in one of his famous texts in Aqidah, Usuluddin, he starts by saying that a person should follow the understanding of the companions of the Quran and the Sunnah. And this is our methodology, the methodology of Ahl Sunnah, i.e. the 4 schools of fiqh and the 3 schools of Aqidah. We follow the understandings of the companions of the Quran and the Sunnah, not the Quran and the Sunnah itself. If a person were to try to understand the Quran and the Sunnah without the intermediary of the 4 schools of fiqh, which in summary are the opinions and the principles of understanding of the companions and the tabi'een, then they will fall into some of the issues that the scholars of the past have detailed with regards to the literalist approach to understanding fiqh and Islam, and many mistakes will be made. Likewise, we will use the context and the perspective of our times in trying to understand the Quran and Sunnah, and this will lead to some problems. As an example, one of the main philosophies of understanding today, the philosophy of science, where if we cannot see it, if we cannot measure it, if we cannot qualify its existence through a medium of measurement, then we cannot say that it exists. That goes against our understanding of matters that relate to the akhirah, matters that relate to the unseen. So having a framework that we base our understanding upon protects us from falling into the traps of some of these modern perspectives and theories and philosophies. And these modern perspectives and theories and philosophies, they will change just as they have changed over time. Modern philosophies, modern theories, modern perspectives, they change. We can see over the last 30 years there has been a shift and a change in many areas of modern understanding, and many new ideologies and philosophies have come to the surface that are relevant today that did not exist yesterday, although they may be based upon those that existed yesterday. Likewise, tomorrow there will be new philosophies and ideologies that will exist that do not exist today, and sometimes they are at loggerheads with each other. There are things that were deemed morally incorrect 30 years ago that today are deemed morally correct. Whereas in Islam, we have a consistent and coherent framework of morality, of theology, and of philosophy, and these are kept safe for us by the 4 schools of fiqh and the 3 mainstream schools, I should say, of Islamic theology. So the Hanafi madhab, the Shafi'i madhab, the Maliki madhab, and the Hanbali madhab, and the Hanbali school of Aqidah, the Ash'ari school of Aqidah, and the Maturidi school of Aqidah. And we should not dispute with each other in relation to these things. We should accept that these are the schools of Ahlus Sunnah traditionally. If we try to take out one of these schools, as we sometimes find that a particular group of Muslims will attack another group of Muslims due to theological differences, these differences have been in existence for generations, for centuries, and these differences in understanding and differences of opinion are based upon principles of understanding of the Quran and the Sunnah. The principles of understanding differed, therefore the understanding of these things differed, and they are areas which it is okay for us to differ, as long as they are traditional schools, mainstream schools, accepted by the majority of the scholars of Islam. There is no problem in following one of these schools. The 4 schools of fiqh and the 3 schools of aqidah, they fall into that group, inshaAllah, bi'idhnillah. So, to continue, he says, what taqwa, now a person, he may ask, how is it that I know what God consciousness is, taqwa is? How is it that I can follow the acts of taqwa in order to find guidance if I don't know what taqwa is, guidance, God consciousness is? He says, وَالتَّقْوَى عِبَارَةٌ عَنْ امْتِثَالِ أَوَامِرِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى وَاجْتِنَابِ نَوَاهِهِ. That taqwa is basically to act upon the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and stay away from the prohibitions. So as we mentioned earlier, it is to study the ahkam of Islam. Then he says, فهما قسمان وأنا أشير عليك بجمل مختصرة من ظاهر علم التقوى في القسمين جميعا. So now he's leading us to the second section, or sorry, I should say the first section after the introduction, where he's going to discuss in a summary some of the applications of taqwa, outward applications of taqwa, starting with tahara and salah, etc. So what we are going to do for the sake of this series is we're going to take the title, because that gives us an indication of what we need to study in detail, and for those that have access to a book, or and I should say a book with a teacher, then they can study those things at a later date, or they can try to facilitate for themselves a means of studying. So either study in a well-known institution which is accessible to you, or study in your local masjid if your local masjid has lessons which are accessible to you, or if worst case comes to worst, study online. And online studying, it should be seen as a supplementary. It should not be one's main course of understanding Islam, because it is very easy to assume that you've understood something but you have not. And the benefits of studying in person, number one, the barakah of the majlis, of sitting in the gatherings of knowledge, the sakina that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala descends upon those sitting in a gathering, the relationship that is built with the teacher, and the relationship of seeing the teacher and seeing how the teacher applies the knowledge that a person is trying to take from this particular teacher, etc. The benefits of studying in person are numerous, and in fact they cannot be counted. So a person should not rely on online studying. Online studying should be seen as supplementary. It should be seen as the go-to if we are not able to study in person. Another question which may arise from this is, what madhab should a person study? If they want to study fiqh, what madhab should a person study? So usually a person would study the madhab of their people. So if a person comes from a background wherein the predominant madhab is the Hanafi madhab or the Shafi'i madhab, then it would be logical to study the madhab of the people. Why? Because it leads to unity and unison within the community group. But if a person does not have access to the traditional madhab of their people, then they study that which is accessible to them. So if there is a local imam or a local teacher or a local scholar that teaches any of the four madhabs, and a person has not studied anything in fiqh, they should study the madhab available to them, as this is from the Quran and Sunnah, and it provides a framework of understanding the Sharia. And at a later date, if they wish, they can go on to perhaps seek out someone who can teach them in more detail the madhab of their people traditionally. For someone who is a new Muslim, they can study that which again is more accessible to them. And I would recommend that a person studies either the Hanafi or the Shafi'i madhab. Why? Because they are the most accessible today, and they are the most predominantly practiced and studied madhabs in the UK, and I would suggest in Europe and globally. But if a person has access to the Maliki madhab or the Hanbali madhab, and they wish to study the Hanbali or the Maliki madhab, then of course that's their choice. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant them success and grant us all success. So we're going to take the introduction to this section, and then we're going to take the titles from the subsections within this first section. We're not going to go in too much detail into each subsection, because it will take a long time, number one, and number two, you can read these inshallah, and it's pretty clear what he's saying. So he says, اعلم أن أوامر الله تعالى فرائض ونوافل. He says, know that the commandments of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are either obligations, compulsory upon the individual or the collective, or they are acts of voluntary nature. A voluntary act of salah, for example, a voluntary act of purification, a voluntary act of charity, etc. He says, فَالْفَرْضُ رَأْسُ الْمَالِ وَبِهِ تَحْصُلُ النَّجَاةِ. And this is a very important statement that Al-Ghazali is saying now. He says, the obligatory acts constitute the capital by which salvation is attained. And if we were to look at the example of a trade, if a person has no capital, then it is impossible for them to invest. Likewise, if a person has no fard, then the nafil is not going to benefit him. If a person is praying the nawafil prayers, but they are not praying the fard prayer, it's not going to benefit them. If a person is praying tarawih, which is a nafil prayer, but they are not praying the fard prayer for the entire year prior or after Ramadan, then it is perhaps unlikely that tarawih will benefit them. Bi-idhnillah, the tarawih will be a means of guidance, and I would not suggest that a person who does not pray the fard leaves off the nafil, and that's not what Imam al-Ghazali is saying. What he's saying is to get the priorities straight. It's better that a person goes to sleep early in order to wake up for Fajr than prays the night in voluntary acts and then sleeps and misses Fajr. The first is more pious than the latter. So it's about understanding our priorities. And so knowing that our capital is our fard, that which is obligatory upon us, is very important, because that leads to a question. So what then is obligatory upon me? And that is the first thing that a person would start with when studying Islam. He says, وَالنَّفْلُ هُوَ الرِّبْحُ وَبِهِ الْفَوْزُ بِالدَّرَجَاتِ. As for the voluntary act of worship, the nafil, it is the profit. And via the profit, a person reaches the higher levels of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's pleasure and success in the akhirah. So again, if we look at the tradesperson, a person, if they have the capital, they can invest, and that investment will lead to more profits. So we have to have that capital, and we have to understand what our capital is. قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال الله عز وجل ما تقرب إلي المتقربون بمثل أداء ما افترضته عليهم ولا يزال العبد يتقرب إلي بالنوافل حتى أحبه فإذا أحببته كنت سمعه الذي يسمع به وبصره الذي يبصر به ولسانه الذي ينطق به ويده التي يبطش بها ورجله التي يمشي بها. So the Prophet ﷺ, he said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, so a hadith Qudsi, those who draw near to me do not draw near to me with anything better than the acts I have made obligatory upon them. So if a person now who says to themselves, how can I attain the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? What can I do to gain Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's pleasure? The first thing they need to start with, the obligatory acts. So they need to know what is obligatory. And of course, the very basic obligatory act which every single person is aware of, the salah. So having the prayers in order. Some of the early scholars of Islam, they would say, if a person's prayer is not in order, nothing else for that person will be in order. If a person cannot be on time for his salah, then he will not be on time for other things. So it's very important to start with that which is compulsory, obligatory, because that provides us with the foundation for the house upon which we want to build. He says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, according to the Prophet ﷺ, and a servant continues to draw nearer to me by voluntary acts of worship until I love him. So a person starts with the foundational acts and builds upon them with the voluntary acts until that person acquires the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us from those that He loves. And then he says, and when I love him, I become the hearing with which he hears, the sight with which he sees, the tongue with which he speaks, the hand with which he strikes, and the foot with which he walks. So basically, this person becomes muwaffaq. This person is a person of tawfiq. He is granted success by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in all of his affairs. And that's the person that we want to be. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us this person. Then he says, ولن تصل أيها الطالب إلى القيام بأوامر الله تعالى إلا بمراقبة قلبك وجوارحك في لحظاتك وأنفاسك من حين تمسي إلى حين تصبح. So he says, know, O seeker, you dear seeker, that you will not be able to rise to carry out the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala until you are able to monitor your heart and your limbs in your every moment and every breath from the time that you wake up until the time that you sleep. So he's saying, in order to attain the ability to carry out the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you have to have an ability to monitor your heart, to ask yourself about your heart and your limbs and that which they engage in. Then he says, فَاعْلَمْ أَنَّ اللَّهَ تَبَارَكَ وَتَعَالَى مُطَّلِعٌ عَلَى ضَمِيرِكَ وَمُشْرِفٌ عَلى ظَاهِرِكَ وَبَاطِنِكَ وَمُحِيطٌ بِجَمِيعِ خَطَرَاتِكَ وَلَحَظَاتِكَ وَخَطَوَاتِكَ. And he says, know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is ever observing and observes your innermost heart, your innermost thoughts. He knows that which you say, that which you think, that which you do. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sees you in all times. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is aware of us in everything that we do. And the example that we can take is the way that we would interact with a camera. If we knew that a camera was focusing on us in every single moment of our lives, how would we act? Our actions would be different. Our speech would be different. Perhaps it would even affect our thoughts. Likewise with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and of course for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the greatest of examples. We cannot compare a camera to the awareness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but just to kind of bring it to our attention. With Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if we were to become aware that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sees us all the time and knows exactly what we are doing and hears our innermost thoughts and is aware of our innermost desires, what would that mean? How would we interact with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in every single situation? He says, وسائر سكناتك وحركاتك وأنك في مخالطتك وخلواتك متردد بين يديه فلا يسكن في الملك والملكوت ساكن ولا يتحرك متحرك إلا وجبار السماوات والأرض مطلع عليه. He says, to summarize, that there is not a movement nor is there a stillness in existence except that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is aware of it. And this, we cannot comprehend the ability of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but it gives us an insight into Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's capability, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is aware of everything at every moment. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is aware of that which was, that which is, and that which isn't, but He is aware of how it would be if it were to be. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is aware of absolutely everything. And so when we interact with others, when we interact in our daily lives, we should be interacting with that consciousness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that is called muraqabah. He says, فَتَأَدَّبْ أَيُّهَا الْمِسْكِينُ ظَاهِرًا وَبَاطِنًا بَيْنَ يَدَيِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى. He says, so therefore, O destitute one, and of course we are all destitute and we are all impoverished and we are all extremely poor in comparison to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, al-Ghani. Cultivate a deep courtesy with the divine in your outer self as well as in your inner self, the courtesy and bearing of a humble, erring slave in the presence of his supreme, all-powerful master. So he's saying, be aware of this fact, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is ever aware, and ta'addub, be a person of adab in the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in all of your affairs, whilst you are in public, whilst you are in private, with your outer actions and your inner actions. When we think, we are not alone in our thoughts. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is aware of our thoughts. So having the ability to be aware of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's presence at all times, this is what we should aspire towards, and this is muraqabah. And if we can do that, then this in of itself will change us as people, will change our actions. An example of this, we know that it is impermissible to have ill thoughts of others. We should have husn al-dhan for others. We should give others excuses and make excuses for them. So when a person does something to me which I dislike, I am aware that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows my thoughts. Therefore, I will try my best to give them an excuse from within. It's not just about on the tongue, but it's about from doing it within. Why? Because I know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is aware of my thoughts. Then he says, وَاجْتَهِدْ أَلَّا يَرَاكَ مَوْلَاكَ حَيْثُ نَهَاكَ وَلَا يَفْقِدَكَ حَيْثُ أَمَرَكَ. And be cautious of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala seeing you where you shouldn't be, and not seeing you where you should be. So at the time of salah, are you in the masjid or are you praying as you should be? And when you are committing a sin, you are doing something where you are being present in something you should not be present in the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he's saying, be aware of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and make sure Allah sees you where you should be and does not see you where you shouldn't be. وَلَن تَقْدِرَ عَلَى ذَلِكَ إِلَّا بِأَن تُوَزِّعَ أَوْقَاتَكَ وَتُرَتِّبَ أَوْرَادَكَ مِنْ صَبَاحِكَ إِلَى مَسَائِكَ. And he says now, you will not be able to do that unless you order your time and you arrange your time and your day so that you have precise time and precise actions that you carry out throughout the day, in particular parts of the day. As the famous saying goes in Arabic, that if you do not cut your time will cut you. If you do not use your time will use you. So it's very important to order our time in a way which is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and this will help us to make sure that we are where we should be and we are not where we shouldn't be in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He says, فَأَصْغِ إِلَى مَا يُلْقَى إِلَيْكَ مِنْ أَوَامِرِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى عَلَيْكَ مِنْ حِينِ تَسْتَيْقِظُ مِنْ مَنَامِكَ إِلَى وَقْتِ رُجُوعِكَ إِلَى مَضْجَعِكَ. He says that you need to basically be aware of the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from the moment that you wake up until the moment that you sleep. Be aware of the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that relate to you and that which you do from the beginning of your day until the end of your day, so that you know that you are doing what Allah wants from you at the time that Allah wants it from you, and you are not doing what you shouldn't be doing in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And with that, inshallah, we'll end this episode. So just to summarize, the purpose that we are going to go through this book is to attain what Imam al-Ghazali has mentioned here, which is the ability to be aware of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to make sure that we are doing what we should be doing and we are not doing what we shouldn't be doing in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we are doing those things when they are supposed to be done. وصلى اللهم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين.
ادب مع الله علا وجل بأن تلازم الحياة والذل منكسرا تحت الحياة وخاضعا تحت المهابة إليه ضارعا